The kitchen was filled with the savory smell of herbs and garlic sizzling on the stove as Daniel Finch carefully chopped a medley of fresh vegetables for dinner. Each steady stroke of the knife against the cutting board resonated in the open, modern kitchen of his high-rise penthouse, showcasing his careful precision, both in cooking and in life. At 42, Daniel was a commanding presence, tall, broad-shouldered, with intense steel-gray eyes that had a way of sizing people up, cutting straight through facades. Those sharp instincts had helped him build Finch Real Estate into a thriving empire in the competitive world of property development, making him a name and a force in the city. The late afternoon light stretched across the gleaming, stainless steel appliances he'd installed during a recent remodel, casting warm shadows across the room. To Daniel, cooking offered a break from the high-stakes grind of his profession. It was a rare moment of calm. As he adjusted the temperature on the pan where a salmon fillet was cooking to perfection, he heard the sharp, unmistakable click of high heels on the hardwood. He looked up to see his wife of 14 years, Josephina, entering the kitchen, her entrance as grand and self-assured as ever. She was dressed in a sleek, black designer dress he didn't recognize, something tight and daring that left little to the imagination. Her perfume was just as unfamiliar, a sophisticated scent he hadn't bought for her, and it lingered heavily in the air as she moved past him, barely offering a glance. "Don't wait up, babe," Josephina said with a casual wave, her focus on her own reflection in the microwave door rather than on him. Her long dark hair was styled into carefully crafted waves, her makeup noticeably heavier than usual. Daniel put down the knife, his jaw tightening as he took in her indifference. For 14 years, he'd poured himself into their life together. While he had worked tirelessly to build his business and ensure a secure future, she had pursued her own ventures, each one costing him time, patience, and, yes, plenty of money. From a boutique that bled funds to a jewelry line that never took off, every endeavor seemed to drain more from him than it returned. "Going on a date with my new lover," she said nonchalantly, fixing her lipstick with a self-satisfied smirk, as though this were the most normal announcement in the world. A quiet storm of rage filled Daniel's chest, but his hands remained steady as he set down the knife beside the chopping board. He stared at her, his usually composed eyes flashing with an intensity that could make even his toughest business competitors back down. "What are you talking about, Josephina?" he asked, his voice measured, masking the anger that simmered just below the surface. In 14 years of marriage, with everything he'd invested in her, emotionally, financially, everything, he never imagined she'd so boldly disregard their life together. "Oh, come on," she laughed, a mocking tone lacing her voice, dismissing his reaction with a wave of her hand. "Don't be so dramatic, Daniel. Fernando's been waiting patiently for this. I'm not going to waste time here playing the doting wife to a boring businessman." In that instant, Daniel saw her clearly, perhaps for the first time, the sense of entitlement, the unearned arrogance, and her utter lack of gratitude or respect. Every carefully placed element of her beauty seemed hollow now, a facade of decadence hiding nothing but disregard. "Walk out that door," he said in a tone colder than steel, "and we're done. Our marriage, our life, all of it, over." She turned to him with a sneer, lips painted in a contemptuous smirk. "Don't fool yourself, Daniel. You're not strong enough to leave me. Who else would put up with you? Your endless talk of business deals, your pathetic need to be perfect." His hand gripped the edge of the counter as she swept toward the door, heels tapping against the floor with a finality that felt like bullets. Watching her go, Daniel knew his life was about to change irrevocably. But in the coming days, Josephina would find out that the husband she'd underestimated had a backbone made of steel and plans of his own. Daniel's gaze didn't waver as he watched Josephina strut out the door, a final smirk dancing on her lips as she walked away without a second thought. After the door clicked shut, the only sounds left were the ticking of the kitchen clock and the faint sizzle of the salmon he'd been so carefully preparing. Standing in that silent kitchen, Daniel felt a new, cold clarity washing over him. 14 years together, countless shared dreams and plans, she had tossed it all aside as casually as one would drop a worn-out piece of clothing. The words she'd thrown at him moments before echoed in his mind, each one dripping with contempt and betrayal. They had been through so much together. Daniel remembered supporting her, always being her rock through every failed business idea, every indulgent purchase she'd made. Her attempts at creating a boutique, a high-end jewelry line, and even a lifestyle blog, all failures that, somehow, he had ended up paying for, both financially and emotionally. In those years, he'd never once resented her for those missteps, never doubted his commitment to stand by her side. But in a single, callous moment, she'd shown him exactly where he stood in her world, a provider, a bank account, and a fool. As the realization set in, he felt no tears, no immediate grief. Just a sharp sense of clarity, one he hadn't felt in a long time. His mind began calculating the next steps, shifting away from the pain she'd caused and toward a single, unwavering goal. He wasn't going to be left humiliated, blindsided, or ruined. She might think she'd waltzed off with her lover into a better life, but Josefina didn't know the man she'd been married to for the last decade and a half, not as well as she thought. At the sound of footsteps, Daniel glanced up to see Maria, their housekeeper of 10 years, standing in the doorway, her face a mask of quiet sympathy and sadness. She'd no doubt heard at least part of the conversation. Josefina hadn't exactly made her announcement discreetly. Maria, who had always respected him and served their household loyally, looked at him with a hint of worry in her eyes. "Senor Finch," she murmured, her voice low and gentle. "Is there anything I can do?" Daniel gave her a small nod. "Maria, take the rest of the day off. In fact, take the week off, fully paid. I'll handle things here." His voice was calm, but Maria could hear the finality in his words. She hesitated, glancing back toward the direction Josefina had gone. "Yes, Senor Finch," she replied softly, nodding before heading for the door. As she passed, her expression turned stern, and with a slight shake of her head, she muttered, "Some people don't know what they have until it's gone." Alone now, Daniel felt a strange sense of liberation that mingled with the fresh wound her betrayal had inflicted. She'd tested his patience, taken advantage of his loyalty, and ultimately revealed her true colors without a hint of remorse. But he wasn't about to crumble or sit back and watch her take his life apart piece by piece. No, he had a plan, and the beginnings of it were already clicking into place. He strode over to his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he reached a number he'd kept saved but hoped he'd never need to use. With a calm resolve, he pressed call. After 2 rings, a gravelly voice answered. "Rodney," Daniel said, his voice hard and unyielding. "It's time. Execute Plan 0. She finally showed her hand. There was no need for an explanation. Rodney, his long-trusted security advisor, had known this call might come someday. "Understood, Mr. Finch. Should I contact Jeffrey as well?" "Yes. Have Jeffrey file everything first thing tomorrow. And, Rodney, make sure Sue sends over the documentation tonight. I want every detail ready by morning." "Consider it done, sir." Ending the call, Daniel felt a new determination coursing through him. He wasn't going to lash out or plead for her to come back. He was going to prepare, strategize, and protect everything he'd worked his entire life to build. This was his empire, and he wasn't about to let anyone, especially not Josefina, destroy it. That night, Daniel sat alone in the penthouse, surrounded by the quiet elegance of the life he had built, a life that suddenly felt different, almost foreign, in the wake of his wife's betrayal. He glanced around the space, taking in each carefully chosen detail, the art, the furnishings, the renovations he'd done, all meant to create a sanctuary for them both. Now, it was clear she had never valued any of it the way he had. His thoughts drifted back through the years, memories flooding in of every sacrifice he had made for Josefina. She had always dreamed big, and he'd done his best to support those dreams. He remembered the boutique she had opened with enthusiasm, talking for hours about fabrics and designers, convincing him it would be a success. But it hadn't taken long for her to lose interest, and eventually, it fizzled out. Next was the jewelry line, expensive materials, high-end marketing. She spent thousands without a thought, constantly demanding more to finance each whim. And he'd given it to her, convinced that supporting her dreams was what a good husband did. Then came her lifestyle blog, where she was supposed to share fashion advice, travel tips, and glimpses into the high society life she craved so deeply. Despite hiring photographers, social media managers, and brand strategists, the project had flopped spectacularly. She blamed everyone and everything else, but never once stopped to consider that maybe the issue was her lack of dedication, her inability to commit beyond the initial excitement. Daniel realized now that these ventures weren't dreams for her, they were distractions, each one an attempt to satisfy a restless dissatisfaction she carried within herself. He had become a bystander in her life, a reliable source of support that she took for granted, always counting on him to be there, always expecting him to fix her mistakes. And tonight, she had decided he was no longer enough. She had flippantly dismissed their marriage, walked out with nothing but disdain in her eyes, barely even acknowledging the years he'd poured into making her life comfortable. Now she was off with Fernando, a name Daniel had learned through his private investigator. Fernando, a man whose own business was faltering, a man who likely saw Josefina as a ticket to wealth and status. The irony was almost laughable. Daniel knew now that both of them were using each other, too selfish to see that they were each just part of a game. His phone vibrated, jolting him from his thoughts. It was a message from Sue Wilkins, the private investigator he'd hired a few months back. At the time, Daniel had begun to notice small changes in Josefina's behavior, oddly timed trips, new clothes, and mysterious expenses on their credit card statement. Part of him had wanted to believe she was simply indulging herself, but a darker intuition had gnawed at him, urging him to investigate. The text read, "Final batch of surveillance photos and recordings ready. Evidence includes hotel stays, dinner dates, and financial transactions." There was also an attachment, an audio file from one of her recent meetings with Fernando. They were discussing plans to get access to his accounts and assets, speaking as if Daniel were a pawn in their elaborate scheme. He opened the attachment, steeling himself as their voices filled the room. The two of them laughed about how easily she'd played the dutiful wife, sneering at the idea that he'd never suspect a thing. Fernando spoke with the smug confidence of someone who thought he was in control, referring to Daniel's success as if it were something to be looted rather than earned. Josefina's laughter was low and mocking, utterly devoid of the warmth he'd once believed she felt for him. Listening to their cold, calculated plotting, he felt the last shred of affection he had for her snap. The woman he'd loved, the woman he'd trusted, was gone. What was left was someone else entirely, a stranger, willing to scheme and lie to rob him of everything he'd worked for. He closed his phone and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the finality settle in. Whatever doubts he'd had about ending their marriage, about cutting her out of his life, were gone. Josefina had crossed a line there was no coming back from, and now he had to protect himself. Grabbing a pen and pad, he began to outline his next moves, each step planned with the same precision he applied to his real estate deals. The love he'd once felt was replaced by a cool resolve. Josefina thought she could outsmart him, take what he had built and walk away unscathed. But she had made the mistake of underestimating him, something he would make sure she would come to regret. Daniel leaned back in his chair, surveying the notes he'd just jotted down, his mind already calculating the intricate maneuvers needed to protect his assets and secure his future. Every dollar, every piece of property, every part of his empire would be meticulously safeguarded against the betrayal he now knew he faced. He'd spent his entire career mastering the art of real estate deals, and he was about to apply that same strategic finesse to dismantling any hold Josefina thought she had over his life. The phone in his hand felt heavy, but Daniel made the call with a calm confidence. "Rodney," he said as his head of security answered. "I want everything secured by tomorrow morning. Offshore accounts, the properties, the corporate holdings, handle it quietly and without a trace." "Yes, Mr. Finch," Rodney replied without hesitation. He was a man Daniel trusted implicitly, one who'd been with him long enough to understand his level of detail and discretion. Rodney didn't ask questions, he didn't need to. As Daniel laid out instructions for the more delicate parts of the plan, he envisioned every layer of his life, carefully fortified against the wreckage Josefina intended to cause. She thought she could fool him, that he was somehow blind to the lies and deception. But she was about to discover that while he might have been patient, he was far from passive. Also, he continued, contact Jeffrey Church first thing. The divorce papers need to be drafted, filed, and ready for delivery. Full documentation, financial records, every last detail. Jeffrey has everything he needs, but let's ensure he's kept fully in the loop. Consider it done, Mr. Finch, Rodney replied, his tone steady. Do you need us to involve any additional security for Mrs. Finch? Daniel considered for a moment. Not yet. Let her think she's in control for a while. But from now on, monitor any attempts she makes to access my accounts. I want alerts on every move. Ending the call, Daniel felt a strange calm settle over him. The betrayal stung, but this plan, this level of control he was about to reclaim, dulled that sting. In his world, things were built with care, dedication, and caution. His fortune, his businesses, his reputation, every part of it had been painstakingly crafted and protected. If she thought she could walk away with any of it, she was in for a bitter surprise. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Jeffrey, his attorney. Jeffrey was one of the few people Daniel trusted with his most personal matters. The man had a brilliant mind and a reputation for crafting ironclad legal strategies, especially in cases of betrayal and high-stakes finances. Received your instructions, Jeffrey's message read. Documentation is in place. Should I move forward with the preliminary filings? Daniel typed back, yes. First thing tomorrow. I want her blindsided. Jeffrey's response was quick and direct, consider it done. As Daniel set down the phone, he could almost picture Josefina's reaction. She'd expect him to be the same supportive husband she'd always known, too committed or too weak to take decisive action against her. She didn't know yet, but she'd soon learn that she had crossed the wrong man. Every move, every step she took, he would be 2 steps ahead, ready to dismantle any fantasy she had of walking away unscathed. With his plan set in motion, Daniel felt an eerie sense of peace wash over him. Josefina might think she was untouchable, but by the time he was through, she'd realize just how carefully and strategically he'd protected himself. She had gambled everything on the belief that he was a man she could walk over, but she was about to discover she was wrong. Across town, in a swanky rooftop bar surrounded by glass walls overlooking the city, Josefina sat across from Fernando Lehman. The dim lighting gave the whole scene an intimate, almost conspiratorial feel, and Josefina was in her element. Her laughter echoed across the table as Fernando refilled her champagne glass, his eyes glinting with the thrill of their shared secret. Both were brimming with confidence, their heads full of grand plans for a future built on Daniel's wealth. You should have seen his face, Josefina said, the memory of Daniel's reaction bringing a sly smile to her lips. He just stood there, stunned. I bet he'll think I'm at some charity dinner with the girls right now. Poor Daniel, so predictable, always assuming he knows everything. She sipped her champagne, her contempt barely concealed as she imagined the life she'd be walking away from soon enough. Fernando, dressed in a designer suit that was just a little too flashy for his financial reality, leaned back, matching her smug expression. Men like him, he said, flashing a smile that held just a hint of mockery, they always think they're in control. They spend their whole lives building fortunes, only to leave themselves wide open. Josefina raised her glass in agreement, her eyes dancing with a mixture of mischief and satisfaction. Fernando was exactly what she'd been looking for, exciting, unpredictable, a far cry from Daniel's cautious and careful nature. She had convinced herself that Fernando offered her the excitement and passion she'd been missing, ignoring the red flags that whispered he was interested more in her husband's money than in her. But as far as she was concerned, Fernando's motives were irrelevant. He was just another piece in her game. Once we get access to the accounts, Fernando said, lowering his voice as he leaned across the table, we can start making moves. I know people who could handle the transfers discreetly, and we'll have everything we need to start fresh, wherever we want. Josefina's eyes sparkled at the thought. She had fantasized about this escape for months now, picturing a life free of Daniel's rules and expectations, free from a marriage she had grown to resent. All that remained was finalizing their plan. Daniel, in her mind, would be too blindsided to react in time. And after all, she reasoned, hadn't she earned a little freedom? "What about your business?" she asked coyly, tracing her finger around the rim of her glass. "Won't you need some of the funds to keep it from going under?" Fernando's expression flickered, but he covered it with a smooth smile. "A few investments, and we'll be fine. Besides, with access to Finch real estate, I could turn things around. His connections, his assets." She didn't need to hear the rest. It was all part of the fantasy they had been building together. For the first time in years, she felt powerful. She was sure that Daniel, the ever-dutiful husband, would be lost without her, that he'd quietly fold without a fight. To her, he was little more than a figurehead, a man who took himself too seriously and would rather keep up appearances than make waves. She didn't realize just how deeply she underestimated him. Nearby, Sue Wilkins, the private investigator Daniel had hired, was discreetly seated at the bar, capturing every damning detail of their conversation. From her position, she could snap clear pictures of the pair, record their exchanges, and send them straight to Daniel. She had been following them for months, documenting every step of their plan to fleece him and confirming Fernando's role in every sordid detail. As she sipped her drink and snapped another picture of them laughing over their plot, she thought of her client. Mr. Finch had been the definition of calm when he'd hired her, laying out his suspicions without a hint of the emotions that must have stirred beneath the surface. He'd asked for nothing less than absolute discretion, absolute thoroughness. And as she listened to Josefina and Fernando talk about emptying Daniel's accounts, Sue could only marvel at how blind they were to the trap he was setting. Josefina took Fernando's hand across the table, leaning in with a smirk. "It'll be ours soon enough, everything he's built. Just think of it, all those years of him thinking he was the smart one." "Poor Daniel," Fernando chuckled, tightening his grip on her hand. "Always the last to know." They clinked their glasses, toasting to the future they thought was just within their reach. But across town, Daniel Finch was already 10 steps ahead, watching every detail of their betrayal unfold and positioning himself to strike back in a way they would never see coming. Back at his penthouse, Daniel sat in his office, surrounded by the hum of monitors and security feeds showing every corner of his home. This surveillance system, installed months ago when he first suspected something was amiss, now offered him irrefutable proof of Josefina's betrayal. Every conversation, every smug laugh she'd shared with Fernando while he was supposedly away on business, it was all recorded. On the largest monitor, Daniel opened the latest file Sue had sent over. The image loaded, revealing Josefina and Fernando cozied up in a dimly lit restaurant, champagne glasses raised in a celebratory toast. Her eyes sparkled, her face lit with a smug satisfaction he had rarely seen in their own interactions. Every picture, every bit of evidence Sue sent him was like another layer peeled back, exposing a woman he'd never truly known. He realized, with a bitter clarity, that the person he had married was long gone. Next, he opened an audio file. This recording captured a conversation from one of their many clandestine meetings. As the voices of Josefina and Fernando filled the room, Daniel listened, forcing himself to remain composed even as he heard her speak about his wealth as though it were a prize to be taken. "Once we get control of his accounts, we can start making plans," Fernando's voice murmured, oozing with self-assurance. Josefina's reply was chillingly dismissive. "He'll never see it coming. He thinks he's so clever, but honestly, Daniel's too proud to admit he might be wrong about anything." Fernando laughed, a low, mocking sound that made Daniel's fists clench. "To think he built all this, and soon it'll be ours." The recording continued, each word more damning than the last, each line chipping away at any last remnants of sympathy he might have had for his wife. As they spoke about accessing his accounts, manipulating his emotions, and finally putting an end to his control, Daniel felt a steely resolve settle in him. Josefina believed him weak, incapable of standing up to her schemes. It was a grave miscalculation on her part, and he would make sure she felt the consequences of that mistake. He thought back to the early days of their marriage, when he had genuinely believed in their partnership. He'd wanted her to thrive, to succeed in whatever path she chose, even when her ventures failed time and again. He'd stayed loyal, his commitment unwavering, because he thought they were building a life together. How wrong he had been. Daniel took a deep breath, reminding himself that his focus now was precision, not rage. He could dismantle their lives with the same calm he applied to his business, and that was exactly what he intended to do. Glancing over at a smaller monitor, he reviewed the legal documents his attorney Jeffrey had sent over. The divorce filings were prepared, detailing Josefina's infidelity and financial misconduct, backed by photographic evidence and audio recordings. Jeffrey had assured him that with the documentation in place, Josefina would be left with nothing more than her designer clothes and a few personal items. Every account she had counted on accessing, every financial pathway she thought she could exploit, would be shut down. Rodney's team, meanwhile, had already started making quiet but effective transfers to offshore accounts. Every penny he'd earned would be secure, unreachable by anyone who dared to cross him. The legal and financial structure he had built was flawless, designed to ensure that not a cent of his empire would fall into the hands of those who had wronged him. Another message flashed on his screen. Sue had sent additional video footage, a discreet recording from that very night, capturing Josefina and Fernando whispering plans in the corner of the bar, completely unaware of the camera documenting every word. He clicked the play button, and there they were again, toasting to a future they thought was only days away. Sitting back, Daniel felt the calm satisfaction of a plan in motion. Josefina and Fernando might think they were in control, but they were merely actors in a story he was carefully crafting. By the time they realized the depths of his preparation, it would be too late. He would not lash out, nor would he wallow in the betrayal. He would be systematic, precise, and thorough, dismantling every dream they had of taking what was his. They believed him blind to their schemes, too passive to retaliate. But in the coming days, they would learn just how wrong they had been about Daniel Finch. Early the next morning, Daniel's attorney, Jeffrey Church, sat in his office, meticulously reviewing the mountain of evidence Daniel had provided. It was a treasure trove of damning material, surveillance footage, audio recordings, bank statements, and detailed reports from Sue Wilkins, the private investigator. Jeffrey was a seasoned divorce attorney with decades of experience handling complex cases, but even he couldn't recall seeing such a thorough documentation of betrayal. Every piece of evidence painted a clear picture of Josefina's calculated deceit, each file meticulously organized by Daniel, who had evidently spent months preparing for this moment. At exactly 7 a.m., Jeffrey called Daniel to confirm that the divorce papers were ready for filing. The plan was to serve Josefina at her mother's house, where she often stayed after her late nights out. Every document was prepared, each one reinforcing the airtight nature of the case, ensuring that she wouldn't walk away with anything beyond the bare minimum. "Good morning, Daniel," Jeffrey began as his client picked up. "Everything is in order. Once we file, she'll have no legal grounds to challenge this. With the evidence of adultery, financial misconduct, and premeditated fraud, the court will see her for who she really is." Daniel's response was calm but resolute. "Perfect. Make sure the delivery happens at 8 o'clock sharp. I want her caught off guard, and I don't want her to have even a minute to react." "Consider it done," Jeffrey replied, fully aware of the gravity of the request. "And I'll be filing for an emergency freeze on all joint accounts, just to ensure she can't try to make any last-minute transfers. By the time she realizes what's happening, it'll already be too late." Daniel felt a grim satisfaction as he listened to Jeffrey's steady, efficient rundown. Josefina's entire scheme had been based on her belief that he'd be slow to act, too passive to take control. But she had miscalculated spectacularly. This wasn't going to be a messy, emotional confrontation. This would be a swift and strategic disassembling of everything she thought she could take from him. Once the call ended, Daniel opened his email to find a message from Rodney, his head of security. Rodney's team had already taken steps to reinforce every financial and security measure. His accounts were locked, inaccessible to anyone but him, and every property deed had been shifted to his name alone, backed by offshore accounts that Josefina wouldn't be able to trace. The message read, "All preparations complete. Security in place. Mrs. Finch's access has been fully revoked across all accounts and properties. Surveillance feeds are active. Daniel allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The pieces were all falling into place, and he felt a strange calm settle over him. He wasn't relishing the downfall of the woman he'd once loved, but he was satisfied knowing that justice would be served. Her arrogance and greed had brought her to this point, and he would see to it that she understood the full weight of her choices. By mid-morning, Jeffrey had filed the divorce papers, and Rodney's team had ensured that Daniel's assets were secure, every penny shielded from her reach. Daniel knew that within hours, Josephina would feel the walls closing in on her. Her designer lifestyle, her illusions of power and entitlement, everything she'd taken for granted would vanish, one piece at a time. Just then, his phone buzzed with a message from Sue Wilkins, the private investigator. Attached was a new audio recording, one of the final pieces of evidence against Josephina. It captured her voice, laughing with Fernando as she listed the things she'd buy with Daniel's money, talking about the fresh start she believed awaited her. As Daniel listened, any lingering doubts dissolved completely. He would protect what he had built, and he would do it with the same precision and patience he had devoted to his business. Josephina had wanted his fortune, his security, his empire. But what she didn't realize was that he'd seen this coming from miles away, and now, her reckless betrayal would cost her everything. Today marked the beginning of the end for her illusion of control. Josephina strolled into their private bank later that morning, heels clicking confidently across the polished marble floor. She had a purpose today, a final touch to her plan. She'd been certain Daniel would be too occupied or too proud to notice what was happening, let alone stop her. As she reached the manager's desk, she slid her card across the counter with her usual air of entitlement, casting the man a cool smile. "I'll be making a withdrawal today," she announced, already imagining the new life she'd build with her share of Daniel's wealth. The manager took her card with a polite nod, but as he checked the system, his expression shifted from professionalism to unease. He glanced up, his voice carefully neutral. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Finch, but it appears these accounts have been frozen pending an investigation. I'm afraid I can't authorize any transactions at this time." Josephina's smile faltered, quickly replaced by a look of irritation. "What do you mean frozen? That's impossible. I'm Mrs. Finch. Check again." The manager, growing visibly uncomfortable, pulled up more details on his screen. "Yes, ma'am, I understand, but the system shows an immediate freeze due to suspicious activity flagged on your joint accounts. Additionally, I see here that your credit cards have been suspended pending review." She felt her face go hot with anger and disbelief, her carefully constructed plan starting to crumble. This couldn't be happening. She had been so sure of her control, her ability to get what she wanted from Daniel's finances. But now, the realization that he'd been one step ahead began to dawn on her. "Do you know who I am?" she hissed, raising her voice as frustration began to overtake her composure. The manager's face remained professionally impassive, his tone cautious. "Yes, Mrs. Finch, but I must inform you that this freeze is part of a legal action in place. Additionally, we have documentation here of recent unauthorized transfers linked to an external account under Mr. Fernando Lehman's name." He glanced down at his screen, then added, "Our fraud department is handling the investigation, and unfortunately, I'm unable to provide further access." The color drained from Josephina's face. She stammered, trying to process what was happening. Unauthorized transfers. Fernando's account. It felt like her world was starting to spin out of control, the security she'd taken for granted slipping right through her fingers. She grabbed her phone, dialing Fernando's number, desperate for answers. But after 3 rings, the call went straight to voicemail. She called again, and again, each attempt ignored. Her fingers shook as she tried once more, but the result was the same: no answer, no explanation. As she hung up, her mind raced, her desperation turning to panic. The penthouse. She could go home and confront Daniel, force an explanation out of him. She was sure she could talk her way out of whatever he thought he had against her. But when she arrived at the penthouse, she was greeted not by Daniel, but by two moving trucks in the driveway, strangers in uniform carrying out furniture she had handpicked and designer clothes she'd spent months collecting. She stormed through the door, her heels clacking angrily as she approached a man in a suit who seemed to be directing the movers. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice wavering with barely contained fury. "This is my home." The man turned calmly, holding out a stack of documents. "Actually, Mrs. Finch, this property was sold early this morning. The transfer of ownership has already been completed. All personal belongings are being packed up and moved to the garage, as specified in the sale agreement." She snatched the papers from his hand, her eyes scanning the words in disbelief. Sale agreement, legal transfer, personal belongings. It felt as though the words were blurring on the page, their meaning slow to sink in. This couldn't be happening. Daniel couldn't have sold the penthouse without her knowledge. "He can't do this," she whispered, her voice cracking, the reality of her situation sinking in with an unforgiving clarity. But the man remained composed, his gaze steady. "I'm afraid he already has, Mrs. Finch. You have until 5 p.m. to retrieve your belongings from the garage, or they will be considered abandoned property." Stunned and defeated, Josephina stumbled toward the garage, where her luxurious life lay packed in plain cardboard boxes, each one labeled and stacked neatly. Her designer clothes, her shoes, her jewelry, all reminders of the life she'd taken for granted, now reduced to boxes in a cold garage. With shaking hands, she called her mother, Elena, barely able to choke out the words. "Mom, I need help moving my things. Daniel sold the penthouse. He's frozen the accounts, everything." A long silence followed on the other end. When Elena finally spoke, her voice was laced with a disappointment that cut Josephina deeper than she'd expected. "No, Mija. You destroyed everything." Then, without another word, her mother ended the call, leaving her standing alone among the remnants of her shattered life. Her hands trembling, Josephina tried Fernando's number once more, desperate for someone to help her pick up the pieces. This time, he picked up, but his voice was cold, edged with finality. "Stop calling me," he snapped. "It's over, Josephina. Gladys knows everything. I'm trying to fix my marriage, save what's left of my life. Your mess is your own problem now." Her last lifeline severed, Josephina dropped her phone, watching as the screen went dark, just like the life she had thought would be hers. The woman who had once strolled through life so sure of herself, so certain of her power, was now left with nothing but the bitter weight of consequences she hadn't thought she'd ever face. Days passed in a blur for Josephina, each one bringing new layers of humiliation. Her once prized social circle, the network of friends she'd carefully cultivated over years of high society events and exclusive galas, had begun to turn against her. Friends who once vied for her attention now ignored her calls, and rumors about her infidelity spread like wildfire through the city's elite circles. Every whispered word of her betrayal, every scornful glance, was like salt in the wounds Daniel had so expertly inflicted. It started with her closest friends, those she thought she could rely on. Each one, upon hearing about the divorce and the evidence of her affair with Fernando, had quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to risk their own reputations by associating with someone now labeled as a gold digger and a homewrecker. Her supposed friends sent curt messages or offered silence, making it clear that she was no longer welcome in their lives. On what would have been an ordinary Friday night, Josephina ventured into the exclusive Reynolds Club, one of the last places where she still believed she could find an ally. She had been a prominent member, a regular at its lavish parties, and the club had once been her domain. But as she entered, heads turned, and conversations paused. Eyes followed her with barely concealed disdain, and her former friends turned their backs, pretending not to notice her arrival. Her heart pounding, she approached the bar, trying to maintain a facade of confidence. As she waited for her drink, two women she'd once considered close friends stood nearby, their voices carrying just loud enough for her to hear. "Can you believe she actually showed up?" one of them whispered, casting a contemptuous look in Josephina's direction. "After everything that came out about her and that real estate leech, Fernando. And poor Daniel, he was always too good for her." The other woman shook her head, chuckling softly. I heard she's lost everything. The penthouse, the accounts, all of it. Serves her right. I mean, she really thought she could just take his money and live off it? What a fool. Josephina felt her face grow hot, her fingers tightening around her glass as she tried to ignore their words. But the shame was overwhelming. She could see now just how thoroughly she'd been cut off, her fall from grace complete. The people she'd once seen as her closest friends now treated her with open disdain, casting her out of the world she had once ruled so confidently. She left the club in a daze, her mind spinning. The life she'd so carefully crafted was now a ruin of burned bridges and shattered relationships. With nowhere else to turn, she found herself heading to her mother's house, the one place she believed would still offer her refuge. But when Elena opened the door, she looked at her daughter with a mixture of sadness and resolve. I know why you're here, Josephina, Elena said, her voice hardening. But I won't take pity on you. You did this to yourself. You chose to betray your husband, to deceive the man who gave you everything. Now you face the consequences. Mom, Josephina choked out, fighting back tears. I made a mistake, okay? I didn't think it would end like this. Elena shook her head, a look of deep disappointment on her face. No, you didn't think at all. You only saw Daniel as a tool, someone to use. And now, you have nothing left. You brought this on yourself. With that, Elena closed the door, leaving Josephina on the doorstep, clutching the remnants of her pride as her mother's words echoed in her mind. Defeated, she went to the only place she could afford, the modest hotel where she'd booked a cheap room using her mother's credit card. She collapsed onto the stiff bed, staring blankly at the ceiling as the weight of her actions came crashing down. In her isolation, the only person she could think of was Fernando. Despite his callous rejection, she tried him one last time, desperate for comfort or some sliver of hope. But when he picked up, his voice was colder than ever. Josephina, it's over. My life is ruined because of you. Gladys knows everything. The business is gone, my reputation is destroyed, and I have nothing left to give you. Don't contact me again. The line went dead. Fernando, the man she had sacrificed her marriage for, had finally abandoned her. She was left utterly alone, her future nothing more than a bleak expanse of uncertainty and regret. In that moment, she felt the full weight of her decisions pressing down on her. She had called Daniel boring, predictable, a fool. But now she saw the truth. He had been the strong one all along, patiently enduring her betrayals, quietly building his defenses while she foolishly plotted to take him down. And as she lay in that empty room, Josephina knew one thing with absolute clarity: she had lost everything, not because of Daniel's cruelty or fate's cruelty, but because of her own arrogance and greed. Thousands of miles away, on a secluded private island surrounded by sapphire blue waters, Daniel Finch stood on the balcony of his beachfront villa, the warm sun casting its golden glow over the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, its calm and boundless beauty a stark contrast to the turbulence that had once defined his life back in the city. Here, he was free from the weight of betrayal, from the shadows of deceit, and from the woman who had once nearly destroyed him. It had been 6 months since he had signed the final divorce papers, sealing the end of his life with Josephina. The penthouse and his former life were behind him now, replaced by a new existence marked by peace and independence. Daniel's new life was a carefully crafted one, a testament to the patience and foresight he'd always relied on. While Josephina had been left in a web of disgrace, scrambling to reclaim what she had lost, Daniel had built an entirely new foundation, hidden under layers of shell corporations and quiet investments. His holdings, once public and prominent, were now buried in offshore accounts, managed by trusted confidants who understood discretion. He sipped his coffee, breathing in the salty breeze, and scrolled through the latest updates on his tablet. Finch International Holdings, his new company, was thriving, with ventures spanning across Europe and Asia, each meticulously planned to maintain distance from his former life. The old Daniel Finch had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. His former acquaintances had no way of reaching him, and even his closest business partners now dealt with him only through intermediaries. He was a ghost, free to operate outside the prying eyes of society, a luxury he had come to treasure. A knock at the door broke the silence. It was his assistant, a trusted aide who had accompanied him to the island and managed the finer details of his new life. "Sir, the latest report on Mrs. Finch just came in," she said, placing a manila envelope on the table beside him. She looked at him thoughtfully, as if wondering whether he wanted to relive any part of his past. Daniel's face remained impassive, but he gave a slight nod, motioning for her to leave. When he was alone again, he opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the report inside. The information was as he had expected, yet it stirred something within him, a sense of grim satisfaction mixed with an unshakable clarity. The report detailed Josefina's current situation. She had been forced to live with her mother, having lost every friend and connection she once valued. Her once grand social circle had crumbled, with former friends now unwilling to associate with her after her betrayal became public. Her belongings had been reduced to what little she could fit in a few bags. She had taken on a job cleaning rooms at a mid-range hotel, a stark contrast to the luxurious lifestyle she'd once known. As he read on, Daniel's gaze drifted out to the ocean. He hadn't sought revenge to be cruel or vindictive. He had simply acted to protect himself, to shield what he had built from those who had aimed to take it from him. But the outcome was a poetic justice he hadn't anticipated. Josefina's arrogance, her selfishness, they had all come full circle, leading her to a life she had once looked down upon with disdain. The report concluded with a mention of Fernando Lehman, her former lover. Daniel learned that Fernando had been forced to close his real estate business, plagued by debt and legal troubles from past deals that had finally caught up with him. Gladys, Fernando's wife, had filed for divorce, leaving him with nothing but a tarnished reputation and a string of burned bridges. Josefina and Fernando's grand plans had disintegrated as thoroughly as his ties with them had, both of them left isolated and disgraced by the very schemes they'd once been so eager to execute. For a brief moment, Daniel felt a pang of something almost like pity, but it vanished as quickly as it had come. He had no regret, no remorse, only a calm certainty that he had done what was necessary. Josefina had called him weak, predictable, someone she could manipulate and discard when it suited her. But she had failed to see the strength in his patience, the quiet fortitude he had honed over years of hard work. She had mistaken his kindness for weakness and his restraint for surrender. He set the report aside, allowing himself a rare smile. She had taught him an invaluable lesson, that there are some people who will take advantage of even the deepest loyalty, thinking it makes them invincible. But now, standing here on his island, with the vast ocean stretched out before him, he understood the true meaning of freedom. He was free of her deceit, free of the constant demands and disappointments, free of a life spent supporting someone who had never valued him. He raised his coffee mug to the horizon, a silent toast to the new life he had built, unburdened by betrayal. The best revenge, he realized, was not in destroying his enemies but in letting their own actions become their downfall. Daniel turned back to his tablet, the new phase of his life already unfolding on the screen before him. The world he had left behind would fade, his memory nothing more than a distant story, while he continued forward, free at last.